April? Tomorrow being 1 May. Before we begin, let's go over our administrative emergency procedures. In the event of an emergency, everybody will evacuate to the right through that window, down the fire escape to the alley. You'll assemble on the south side of the building. In an orderly manner, look to the adults and the staff to help evacuate you. If you're downstairs and you're being evacuated, go out the side door at the stairs or the front entrance. Again, assemble on the south side of the building so we can get a head count. That includes you too. Remember the bathrooms, one upstairs, one downstairs. We appreciate if you clean up after yourself. Today is week 30. So you only have 6 more weeks of putting up with us here. So week 30 today, we modified the program a little bit. It's going to be about the Holocaust. It's also going to be about the American soldier in Europe. So, anybody know what happened 71 years ago today in Europe? Anybody know? No, you're close though. Hitler had already committed suicide. The Americans liberated Dachau concentration camp 71 years ago this day. Dachau was the largest concentration camp in Germany. Now, we're going to talk about the American soldiers in Europe building up to the liberation of the camps. This picture. This is a landing craft. Remember on D-Day we talked about landing craft, amphibious assault from the ocean. This is a landing craft with American soldiers packed in. Not sure which invasion it is. What do you guys notice about this picture? What do you notice? Well, they got guns or rifles. What else do you notice? Let's see, this guy here is a military policeman. He's got an MP armband. He looks a little older, maybe of Italian extraction. What do you notice about this little guy?
Very young.
That's exactly right. Very, very young. He's got to be 17 or 18 years old. So during World War II, after full mobilization, 16 million Americans served in the armed forces. In the Army Air Corps, the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Coast Guard. 16 million. We were a country of about 200 million back then. 175 million, I think. So 16 million. 10% of the population served in the armed forces. They were drafted. Most of them did not volunteer. Most were drafted. Our 2 special guests today, Mr. Robert Baker, right here, and Charles Davis were both drafted in the U.S. Army. Robert's from Germantown and Charles is from Centerville. We're going to talk about them a little bit. Most of them were reluctant warriors, but they went to serve their country. When was D-Day? What date?
June 6th,
June 6th, what year?
1944.
Exactly right. That's when the Allies landed on the northern coast of Normandy and prepared for the long track eastwards to defeat Nazi Germany. Hundreds of thousands of young American soldiers landed in France on D-Day and after. All many months after the invasion, the American forces and Allies, British, Canadians, Commonwealth, Free French, all began fighting Nazi Germany moving east. Thousands of vehicles, thousands and thousands of motor vehicles. The U.S. War Department produced 600,000 Jeeps, 750,000 trucks, 100,000 tanks, aircraft, ammunition, rifles, to prepare for the defeat of Germany. All this flooded into Europe from England. They came in all shapes and sizes. They came from every city, every town, They came from every village, they came from every state, every county, they came from every ethnic diversity, Italians, Czechs, African Americans. And the Army was full of these kids. These guys met when they were assigned to their units after completing their training, after mobilization. They all melted into this big cohesive pot known as the U.S. Army. So you had briar hoppers from Kentucky mixed in with kids from South Philly. You had New Yorkers, you had Pittsburghers, you had Germantown, Ohio. Every town had these young men. Women did serve in World War II. Women were volunteers. Anybody know what the Army female volunteers were called?
Nurses.
Nurses. They served as nurses. What was their official Army title? WAC. Women's Army Corps. WAC. Remember that. WAC. The Navy had WAVES. Women's Auxiliary Volunteer Enlisted. They served, the females during World War II served in support services. Nurses, some served as doctors if they were officers, some served as administrative people, intelligence, all sorts of support services. Hundreds of thousands. We just drove back from Atlanta, Georgia last week, and we passed Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, on the south side of Atlanta, north side of Atlanta. Anybody ever heard of that? Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia is where they trained WACs during World War II. So, they form into these cohesive units, platoons, companies, battalions, regiments, and divisions. And they struggled across Europe. 750,000 Americans were wounded in action in World War II. I want you to remember these figures. 750,000 were wounded in action. 416,000 were killed in action. 416,000, that's almost 500,000. And about 200,000 were prisoners of war. So over 1 million Americans were either killed, wounded, or prisoners of war. Now, let's move to Nazi Germany. Anybody know what the term the Holocaust refers to? Go ahead.
When Nazis took all of the Jews and people they didn't see fit, they pretty much killed them.
That's right. The Holocaust is a Yiddish term. It means to burn, conflagration. Now this is a heavy topic, so we're gonna cover this in a manner that's not going to be so in depth. But Nazi Germany, when Hitler came to power, Hitler blamed the Jewish people of the world for all of the ills and ills of Nazi Germany. Thus, when he became Chancellor and eventually the leader of the Third Reich, Germany, the Third Reich, he began to take initiatives to target the Jewish people. But not only did he target the Jewish people, he began to target anybody who was a dissident, anyone who fought against the Nazi regime or believed differently, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, Catholic clergy. He began to target all of these people. And at first, the Nazis established a concentration camp at Dachau. This was the first Nazi concentration camp. Remember this, Dachau, D-A-C-H-A-U. This is the gate entrance at Dachau. It's near Dachau, Germany, down by Augsburg and Munich in southern Germany. So initially what they did was they would round up these people in Germany, usually early in the morning, raids, round them up. Sometimes they would order that they all assemble in the square, and the SS, Hitler's bodyguard, called the Schutzstaffel, would cart them off to the concentration camps. Initially, they were put through very heavy work, not fed very well. They were humiliated, dehumanized. As the war continued, and Germany, as we talked about in previous classes, as Germany expanded into Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Russia, Yugoslavia, Holland, Belgium, France, they began to target more and more of these people, these oppressed people. The German term for these people was Untermenschen. Anybody know what that means? Untermenschen, underlife. They looked at these people as less than human, subhumans. This is how the Nazi mind thought. They rounded up more and more, and they began killing many of them out in the fields by shooting them. This is, the best way I can sugarcoat it. They would go into Russia, for example, and they would identify a Jewish village, and they would cordon off the village, and the SS would evacuate all the people from the village. Cordon means secure the village, and they would go out and make them dig ditches and trenches, and they would shoot them. Right, their whole villages, all over Russia. Still today, they find evidence of this. They find mass graves. It got to the point where they killed almost 1 million people just by shooting them. And one thing you kids need to know is there is good and evil in the world. Good and evil. World War II was truly a battle of good against evil. The Allies landed to liberate all the lands. The Nazis held the lands to oppress people. So in about 1942, they realized this is inefficient, the Nazis. This is taking a big toll on our soldiers. It's not a economical way to do this. So, meanwhile, the Allies really don't know all the details of what's going on. They hear rumors coming from the East about atrocities and mass murders, but they don't really know all the details yet. So the Germans decided to build more and more camps. So they went from the concentration camps to what were called the extermination camps. These were built mostly in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Treblinka. Have everybody ever heard of Auschwitz? Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. These camps were built with the intent to kill everyone who came into the camp. There was hundreds, thousands of concentration camps in Germany, Poland, and the occupied countries. There were thousands. Some of the camps could hold up to 100, 200, 300,000 prisoners. Some of the camps could hold 50. Each level of camp was different. The extermination camps, their job was simply to kill innocent men, women, and children. The work camps were designed to get as much labor from the prisoners as possible. In the German armaments, clothing, anything to do with the war, the Germans tried to use the prisoners. More than likely, most of the slave laborers were Ukrainians, Polish, Russians, Hungarians. Most of the Jewish people were sent to the extermination camps. But they murdered everybody. They killed everybody, though, at some point. It's estimated by the end of World War II, the Nazis killed 12 million people in these through their efforts. And 12 million, that's 6 million Jewish people and 6 million non-Jewish. The gypsies, the Poles, the Catholic priests, and so on and so on. This is just a map showing, these are camps in western Greater Germany. These are all camps that were liberated by the Allies. And you can see how many there are. Here's Dachau down here in the south. Here's Landsberg, Gunskirchen. We have two veteran friends who liberated Gunskirchen. Ebensee, which was a terrible camp down in Austria. Mauthausen, terrible camp. Mauthausen was a stone quarry. And what they would do is, it received a lot of the Western Jewish prisoners from Holland, Belgium, and France. They would have them day in and day out. They would have to quarry huge stones up this mountain, and it was backbreaking work. They didn't feed them. They got disease. They got weak. If they couldn't perform it, they shot them or killed them. Now, we talked about the Holocaust, to burn. One of the solutions the Germans came up with was in the large extermination camps, after they murdered people, was to burn them. And why do you think they did this? They didn't do this for any noble reason. They did this simply because they were worried about the outbreak of disease in the camps, which would infect their staff and their guards. And when they dealt with this many people, and remember, 12 million, that's men, women, and children, entire families, generations of families erased, grandparents, kids, grandkids, all erased. This is how they dealt with it. They burned them. They had, they call them crematoriums, and they were large ovens, and this is how they dealt with the victims of the Holocaust. Well, we talked about this. Who were the liberators? Well, the liberators were guys like Bob Baker, Charles Davis, and every other American soldier, Allied soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who overran Nazi Germany. I'll tell you a story. We had a visit 2 years ago by an American infantry division from World War II. They had their reunion here. The average age was about 90. The oldest one was 98. I remember this. But they had two gentlemen with them who had accents. And I asked them, I said, who are these guys that you guys brought? And they said, these are concentration camp inmates that we liberated. They came to America after the war, and they're American citizens now. So one of them, his name was Simon Brotman. And I interviewed him for a little bit. And he was a Polish Jew from Krakow, Poland. His entire family was sent to Auschwitz, and they were murdered at Auschwitz. And the Nazis murdered you by either shooting, gassing, they used crematoriums with gas, or they starved you, and through ill treatment and abuse. But his entire family was murdered at Auschwitz. He was sent to Austria to work in a German munitions factory. When he was liberated, he was 15 years old. You know how much he weighed? He weighed 55 pounds. He said that when he saw the Americans, they had wings on their backs. They were angels. And he started to kiss their boots. And then they blacked out. He was blacked out for 6 weeks. An American field hospital took him in, nursed him back to health. An American unit adopted him, kind of like the company mascot. He did odd chores for them. He interpreted. He could speak English, Yiddish, German. In 1949, he came to America. He joined the American Army. He got his citizenship. He now is the president of an electric company in upstate New York. And this is what happened in 1945 when these camps started to be overrun. We have acquaintances. We have one gentleman who overran a camp and saw the most beautiful girl he ever saw. She was Polish, blonde hair, blue eyes. She was in a camp. And he said, I'm going to marry that girl. And he was a hillbilly from the mountains of Virginia. He married her. They had 9 kids. He brought her back to America. They had 9 kids. But the Americans, when they liberated these camps, were so shocked by what they found, the inhumanity. The British liberated a camp called Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen had a typhus outbreak. Thousands of people died in that camp. And the sad part was after they liberated the camp, they still continued dying because their systems were so deprived of protein and nutrients. Many of the soldiers didn't know what to do, so they would give them rich food, which they would die. So after we overran the camps, most of the guards had fled. Most of the bad people that were involved in running the camps got away. They fled, changed in civilian clothes or a German army private's uniform and got away. So when we got there, one of the first things was to get control over the camp, identify who's in the camp, try to get some sanitary conditions established, food, water, and then medical treatment. But they died in droves after these camps were liberated. The Americans at Dachau sent in a field hospital, and I think 5,000 prisoners died up to about a month after the camp was liberated. This is Larry Reynolds from Middletown. Bob and Charles both know Larry. Larry was a medic, a combat medic, 71st Division. He liberated Gunskirchen in Austria. This is a shipment of little children that was liberated Gunskirchen. Most of them have been separated from their parents. They're probably Polish or Hungarian children. This is before they were really put into the holding camp. Gunskirchen was a small camp, and I'll illustrate you how the Nazis operated. It was a small camp in a forest clearing in Austria. Anybody ever been to Austria? I know Bob has. Beautiful country, pristine, mountains, pine forest, beautiful place. Well, the Nazis took a clearing in a forest, put up perimeter wire around the forest, and then used this as a holding camp for prisoners that were being evacuated from other camps that the Allies were about to overrun. And they put them in the forest and let them try to survive. They never fed them. Simon Brotman, who I was just talking about, was in this camp at Gunskirchen. And he said we would look for snails to eat, anything we could get a hold of. And then the guards would patrol the perimeter. Once in a while they'd decide to have a little fun, they'd shoot a prisoner. They'd kill him, just for fun. Up till days of the war ending, they murdered people. I mean, the war was over by all intents and purposes, and they would march prisoners out to forest clearings and kill them. You know, imagine your family surviving all of that almost to the end, and then a week before the war's over, they take them out and kill them. Completely senseless. This is Jay Holman from Middletown. He liberated Gunskirchen Lager. This is an image of some of the prisoners this is the forest at Gunskirchen. This is what they had to live in. This is Eddie Wallace from Carlisle. Anybody know Eddie? Eddie liberated Dachau. He was a tanker. And very difficult for him to talk about it. His tank battalion supported an American infantry unit. And he saw a lot of really bad things that day. I'll just go back to this letter real quick. You're not going to be able to read it. Stephen Ross was a prisoner at Dachau, and he was liberated by an American unit. He came to America. He became a school psychologist and a very established speaker on the East Coast. And he wrote this letter to the 191st Tank Battalion Association. You know, he said, I remember a flag, an American flag, you know, and he talked about what it meant to him and his family. And this stuff is really important, guys. I recommend when you get a little older, read as much as you can on the Holocaust. Read about the diary of Anne Frank. Anybody read that? A little girl in Holland who ended up, you know, almost making it to the end, but then she was killed at the end by the Nazis. Sometimes the children would be separated from the parents in the camps. The little boys, these are little boys, 12, 13, 14, they probably worked at Dachau. They probably had them doing some sort of labor. Many times they were separated because their parents were killed. So there's a great movie, a 1948 movie out called The Search, Montgomery Clift. If you get a chance, watch this movie. It's incredible. Comes on Turner Classic once in a while. It's about a little boy who was liberated from a camp, and this American GI is trying to find his mother in Germany. It's called The Search. This is Lee Mendenhall, who you guys met a couple weeks ago. Lee was here for D-Day. You guys remember Lee? Lee and Donald? And Lee landed right after D-Day, fought all the way through France, through the hedgerows, fought through the Hürgen forest area along the German frontier, made it all the way to Schwerin, Germany, up in the Baltic Sea. The last thing that Lee did was liberate Woblin concentration camp. And Lee said, we have a letter that he wrote home to his mom and dad. He says in his letter, you won't believe the things that I've seen. And he said, it was one thing to fight through the war, to be shot at every day, to see your friends die. But it was another thing to come across a camp where they brutalized the inmates, starved them, and they didn't know what to do, really. He said, we didn't know what to do. We gave them food and it killed some of them. Woblin was just one of these little bitty camps, 5,000 inmates, but out of the 5,000, 1,000 were dead already. So 20% of the camp was already dead when the Americans got there. This is a prisoner at Woblin. The GIs have given him a cigarette. This is Lee's division, the 8th Infantry Division. You can see the conditions in the back there. Donald Blair, you guys remember Donald? The medic at D-Day? Let me tell you something Donald did at the end of World War II. So Donald landed on D-Day as a medic, unarmed. Across the beach, field station, he treated American enemy wounded. The last thing Donald did in World War II, he was assigned to a Russian slave labor camp. There was 10 to 12,000 Russian slave laborers in this camp. Men, women, and children. Some of the children were still with their parents in this camp. Some of the women had given birth. So Donald was assigned as a medical liaison to this camp. He was the only American in this camp. His job, he was given an interpreter. His job was to assess the needs of the prisoners and to see what they needed medically. And it started to get, they needed everything. They needed blankets for the babies. They needed milk for the babies. They needed all sorts of supplies, medical supplies. So Donald worked diligently. I'll close this window. So Donald worked diligently to take care of these poor people. And they found out, the prisoners found out that Donald had a birthday. So Donald said that some of the prisoners, no, this is after the fall of Germany. Some of the prisoners went out and hunted deer. And they made a big deer dinner, venison. I never cared for it personally. And then the whole group of 12,000 people paraded for him. He sat on a porch of a barracks, and all 12,000 people marched by and whistled a Ukrainian tune for him. And he was just blown away. You know, a little American kid from Bellefontaine, Ohio. And he always remembered that. He always remembered these poor people. Here's some slave laborers. Now, the way it worked with the Nazis was, if you were one of the oppressed people, they put you in one of the camps. If they wanted to exploit you economically, they made you a slave laborer. In other words, they'd go into a town, they'd say, we need 50 women to work in a factory. They'd tell the mayor of the town in the Ukraine, I want 50 people. So these people, through trickery and every ruse, would show up, they'd take them back to Germany, and they would work them to death in these factories. Many times they lived, they didn't live in camps, they lived in little huts and buildings around the factory. They had very little time, very little income. The Germans would give them monetary certificates, but then they would charge them. They were like indentured servants. They could never really get out of there. And they would work in the factories. They would make munitions. They would make weapons. And a lot of them would intentionally sabotage the plants and the items they were making. It was getting so bad, the German army was shooting tank rounds, and it was problematic whether the round would go off or not, because the slave laborers were doing little things to sabotage the war effort. If they caught them, they would execute them or send them to a concentration camp. So after the war ended on May 7th, 1945, May 7th, all over Germany there were millions of these people. The Allies called them displaced persons because they'd been displaced from their homelands. So you had concentration camp inmates, you had Allied prisoners of war who were Allied servicemen, and you had slave laborers all over Germany. If you look at images from Germany 1945, walking down the roads, clogging up the roads, there are millions of these people trying to find their family, trying to make their way home. The United Nations set up camps in Germany to try to collect these people and try to help them get back to their home of residence. This is the infamous Bob Baker right here. This is Bob in 1944. This is Bob today. You guys see the resemblance?
Yeah.
Everybody see that? Bob was in Headquarters Battery, 44th Infantry Division, Divisional Artillery. He was in a motorized unit. They had light weapons carrier trucks and jeeps. So he got to see Europe from a vehicle. Charles was in a motorized unit too. This is from Bob's personal photographs. Do you remember this photo, Bob? These are vehicles from Bob's unit in the street, probably in Austria or southern Germany. Do you remember where this was taken?
I go next up, southern Germany.
Southern Germany. These are concentration camp inmates right here. You see what they're wearing? They're identified by these vertical striped uniforms. The Germans were very organized and very systematic. Once you were taken to a camp, you were assigned an identification number. Many times that number was tattooed on your arm. Preceded by the camp, the first letter of the camp name, Auschwitz, A, and then your number. So this is a cap, blue and white vertical stripes. Some of them were brown and white, depending on the camp you were at. They were very crudely made. The shoes that the prisoners wore were wood and leather. So you can imagine how comfortable they were, clogs basically. The Germans, as I said, were very organized. This is worn on the front of a prisoner's uniform. This is a P for Polish. So they would wear this on the front of their coat to identify them as a Polish prisoner. If you were a political prisoner, you might wear a red triangle. If you were a Jehovah's Witness, you might wear a red triangle with a black triangle superimposed on it. They had a whole system of identifying the prisoners. Not only was the number on your arm, but the number was on your jacket also. Now, I'm trying to interweave the American soldier and the liberation. So, here these guys are over in Europe. Anybody know what this is? This is a helmet. This is an American GI helmet as worn by Bob and Charles. Very simple system. You have a liner and you have the still pot. The still pot could be used for washing, put water in it, soap, for shaving, for cooking. Sometimes you find them, they're all black and charred. That's because they cooked out of them. And it has a metallic taste when you cook out of them. So I'll pass this around. I want you to get a sense how heavy this was. But this was the American GI helmet worn by the American soldiers in Europe during the war. So you can pass that around, make sure it goes to every row, and the last person back there, bring it back up to me when it's done. When the soldiers were away in the service, the parents would post stars in the window, little banners. These were blue stars. We have some downstairs. We have one that has 4 stars on it. That's 4 brothers or sisters served in World War II. If they were killed in action, the star became gold. This is a gold star banner. So the family would put this out. So you all over America, in the windows of houses, you'd see these little banners, blue star and gold stars. When they wrote home, they had 3 ways to send letters. 4 ways you could contact home. You could send a telegram if you were in the rear, which was very infrequently. You could send a letter, a regular letter. You write free in the envelope. On the outside of the envelope, free. If you're in a combat zone, your mail is free. Today, same thing. You write free. That took anywhere from 10 days to 15 days to get back home. You could send a letter airmail. You had to pay for the postage. It would take 3 to 5 days. Or you could send what's called V-mail. Anybody know what V-mail is?
It's where they send the mail on vehicles.
That's close, very close. V-mail, not email, V-mail. Victory mail, V for victory. When you look at World War II, V for victory. Victory Gardens, I think Justin talked about that. V for victory. Churchill, V for victory. But V-mail was ingenious. Think about this. You have 16 million service people. The armed forces has to send supplies to the war front. They have to bring home wounded. And they're tasked with, what are we going to do with all these tonnage of mail? So they came up with an idea. They established Army postal photograph units in ports. You would write a letter out on a template that was issued. That letter would be collected by your unit. It would go to the port. The port would photograph that letter. It would go on microfiche. Thousands of other letters were put on the microfiche. The originals were tossed. The microfiche would arrive back in the United States. There, another Army postal unit would print it out. And they printed out these small little letters like this. This is how small they were. People back home could buy V-mail readers. They were like little magnifying globes. You put it down on a letter and you could read it that way. So I'll pass these around. This is a soldier who was killed in North Africa. These are some of the letters between him and his wife. Please take care of this. Again, responsible party in the back there. All right, the soldiers carried lots of ammunition on them. This is a rifleman. He would have carried a cartridge belt. Each one of these pockets held 8 rounds of ammo. Carried a canteen with water and carried a first aid kit. The first aid kit consisted of a bandage and sulfonamide, a powdered coagulant. We talked about the rations before. This is a breakfast ration. So these guys, when they're moving in combat, there's not a lot of time for hot chow. In the Army, you called eating chow. So they carry the rations. This would have been a breakfast pack. This would have had crackers, a can of nasty eggs, cigarettes, and some other type of meat spread, jelly, stuff like that inside. So they carried lots of these on their vehicles. Now, one of the first things they would do when they got a chance, they find a house and hopefully find some chow. Start looking around, maybe find a chicken, laid some eggs, fish, or a number of other ways to supplement their diet. All right, so here they are. They're moving across Europe. They're liberating the camps. The German army's surrendering. There's Bob Baker again. We're going the wrong way here. Hank Williamson lives in West Carrollton. He liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. He still wears his uniform. He can get in his uniform. These are wedding rings that the Nazis took from prisoners. And, I mean, look how many there are. Each one of these was a husband or a wife. The Nazis would economically, as I've stated many times, try to take advantage of the prisoners. They would cut all their hair off. The hair would be used for stuffing army winter coats. They would take all their gold. They would take their gold fillings out even. And they would melt it down. And they would hide these hoards of loot. At the end of the war, the Americans, the Third Army, Patton's Army, found a bunch of mines at a place called Merkers. And this mine was full of rings and gold fillings and also paintings and art treasures that were looted. A great movie for everybody to watch is called The Monuments Men. Anybody seen it? Yeah. It's a really good movie. It's an excellent movie. And it's not bad for kids either. So here you have the picture of a GI boots are dirty, his cuffs are up. But this GI's got two things he likes around him. He's got a dog, and he's got a little kid here. So all over Europe, liberation was underway. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a few minutes. I want to talk to you about Bob and Charles, and I want you guys to talk to them. Then we're going to go outside the last 5 to 10 minutes. We're going to look at the vehicle out front. I'm going to tell you about the vehicle that we have here and how the American war effort was able to produce these incredible machines. So Bob started out. What we'll do is when you guys ask questions, I'll repeat the question to them so they can understand it, okay? So, Bob Baker, you see the cane? It hurts. It hurts, okay? Bat me in the head with that if you're out of line. Not really. Not really. Bob served in the 44th Infantry Division. Bob was married during World War II to his lovely wife from here in Germantown. Bob went out to Fort Lewis, Washington. The 44th Division originally was a National Guard division from New Jersey, from the East Coast of the United States. And there were a number of kids from this area that went out to the 44th Division. But Bob landed in France in November '44, fought up through the German frontier, ended up breaking through in southwest Germany, coming down through southern Germany and Austria. And then Charles Davis, now you saw Bob's picture. I don't have one of Charles on the screen. So here's Bob in all his glory. Thank you, sir. Here's Charles. Charles and his twin brother from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, were drafted in the Army in 1943 together. The father made some contacts. The Army kept them together. They were assigned to the 517th Airborne Signal Company, the 17th Airborne Division, at Camp McCall, North Carolina. They both arrived on a train, and they get a letter, or the briefer tells them, you're now in an airborne division. You don't walk, you run everywhere. So Albert became a parachutist, and Charles was a glider soldier. Anybody know what a glider soldier is? Anybody know what a World War II glider is? A motorless plane that's pulled behind a transport plane. It's a glider. It glides. It carried vehicles and it carried men, heavy equipment. So Charles went in from England to the Battle of the Bulge, along with his division, and then from there, the Rhine crossing, a massive airborne operation with the British 6th and the American 17th Airborne Division, and then on to Berlin for the occupation. So they both are old soldiers, and they're both here to answer questions. So now that we're more comfortable with this, I want you guys to ask some questions, okay? Pick their minds. Number one, go right ahead. Yes, sir.
Did they know each other in the war?
I'm going to say, Bob would say, thankfully, no, they didn't know each other during the war.
Second the motion.
Okay. Another question. How about asking them ask them about the end of the war, where they were at when the war ended. Bob, where were you at when World War II ended in Europe?
On the Austrian-German border.
How was that celebrated?
Celebrated? We just happy it was over. We didn't celebrate because it wasn't altogether over where we was.
Right.
You know, the Germans was coming back, and we didn't know if the ones coming back didn't have no guns. That's the reason we knew it was over.
So
Otherwise, we wouldn't even know it.
you were seeing a collapse of the German army.
Right.
Where were you at when the war ended on May 7th, Charles?
Paris. Paris, France. They had to leave by chance. Happened to be in Paris on VE Day.
All right. Don't be shy. All right, this young lady right here's got a question. Huh?
She's fixing her camera.
Claire, ask a question.
How old were they?
How old were you when you went in the army?
19.
19.
Not much older than you. That little guy back there's got a question, I know.
How old are they now?
How old are you now, Bob?
92, I'll be 93 in December.
91. 92 in November.
Question, back in the back.
Were they ever wounded?
Were you ever wounded?
No.
No.
It's a glider pilot. They glide in, but then how do they have to just wait until that area is over? I mean, how do they get out? So they can go do
Pardon?
another glider motion. Another
He's
glider.
asking you how the glider's operated, how the pilot chose the landing zone and how you guys got out.
I don't know how he picked a landing zone. I wasn't a pilot, I was a passenger. By the way, the biggest piece of equipment they put in a glider was a Jeep. And part of our training was learn how to lash down that Jeep in the glider. And 4 of us sat in the Jeep and went across the Rhine River. Now, the way they got the Jeep in the glider, the front end of the glider's on a hinge. And it rises up like that, and that's how you got in and out.
When they did an operation, the landing zones were established by the command hierarchy. So the planes would come in, and these are massive operations involving the airborne operation had about 2,000 gliders and planes. So each unit is designated a landing zone. And there's not a lot of room for error. They come in at 800 to 1,200 feet. There's a tow cable. It's prearranged when to cut loose. Once they cut loose, the glider usually can make one turn and a half turn, and then he lands. And sometimes they collide in the air. Sometimes they're coming down, they hit something on the ground. I mean, it's not a how many, what was the percentage of gliders that were destroyed after your operation?
3/4.
They're not usable. 75% of them aren't
25%
usable.
of the gliders were salvageable. Ours, for instance, just as we were coming to a landing, the left wing crashed into a tree. Now, we weren't hurt or anything, but that glider was not usable. And only 25% were whole after the war.
They were made in Troy, Ohio, by the way.
We just
The Waco Museum.
saw one up there.
Yeah.
Why would you use one of those instead of,
Parachute.
well, when you've got a motor? I mean, why not use a regular plane?
Because you can't land, it's an assault landing. You have to seize airfields, you have to seize objectives. You can't land the transport planes under fire like that. You can't, and many times the ground can't accept the planes, the surfaces are rough.
Okay.
So it's mostly vehicles and artillery for the airborne divisions. You know, they go in by parachute and then the glider troops come in.
Okay.
And the other thing was they're silent, and so it was for surprise.
Okay.
Well, yeah. Remember D-Day? What was the first operation we talked about? Anybody remember?
Gliders landing?
That's right. Done by who?
I'm not sure.
The British Army. The bridge seizure at the Orne River Canal. The first Operation D-Day. 6 horse and gliders.
So they would cut those gliders loose and the glider would land, the plane would take off and go
The
back?
plane would come in 1,200 feet. Remember, they're under fire.
Yeah.
They're all under fire. Plane's coming in. He cuts the glider loose. The plane
He takes off.
evacuates the area, heads back to the rear. The glider pilot and his gang negotiate a landing, and they come in and land. They extricate from the glider, and assault their objectives.
I see.
Gliders a one-way trip.
Yeah.
They're made out of canvas, wood, and aluminum tubing. But most of them are canvas and wood. All right, somebody asked Bob a question. Down here on the end.
How long did you serve?
How long did you serve in the Army?
Well, practically 3 years, a month short.
And in World War II, when they went to the war, they weren't sent there for 1 year or 6 months. They were sent there until the war was over. So nobody knew when they were coming home. When the war in Europe ended, and that'll be talked about in one of your upcoming classes, these divisions, some of them were preparing to go to the Pacific now to defeat the Japanese. So, it was not close-ended. When they left for the war, they didn't know when they were coming home, and some of them never came home. Some of the Americans were gone from 1941 to 1946, so almost 5 years. So an American National Guard division from Ohio went to the Pacific Theater and fought from 1942 early all the way to the end of the war.
So Bob was married before he left. Is that right?
You were married before you went in the Army?
Yeah, a month,
A month?
yeah.
And then what did his wife do? What did she do while he was gone?
What'd your wife do while you were off to war?
She had a job down at a steel company in Middletown.
Okay.
We decided to get married to get the $50 a month, so when I got back, we'd have some money to buy a new house.
Okay.
And she worked and she saved her money so we could have a house when we come home.
If you were a married soldier, you got a $50 a month allotment if you were married during World War II. So Bob's thinking outside the box here, you know?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever returned to Europe?
Have you ever returned to Europe?
No,
Have you?
No.
Do you ever want to go back?
no.
My twin brother has, so he went back.
Any other questions? Okay, I'd like to thank our special guests for coming today. Let's give them a hand. All right, well, all right, we'll all move outside and gather around the Jeep. This is Charles Davis, who you guys met upstairs. This Willys Jeep is configured to look like the one that he was in when he went across the Rhine River in the glider assault. These Jeeps were made in Toledo, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan. They were very simple, rugged, very reliable, a small motor. They sound like little lawnmowers when you start them up. It's unbelievable to drive. It's just so much fun. It's got a standard shift in it, but they lived in these vehicles. This is how they lived. And they ate out of them, they slept in them, and most of the times they didn't have tops on them because of the tactical considerations. But this is represented what Charles would have went across. He's carrying a case of rations, extra gas. He was in a signal company, so their job is to communicate. It's got field phones in it. You lay wire, you talk. It's got radio components. It's also got a .30 caliber machine gun, Browning, and that would have been removed from the glider and put inside the Jeep when it was put into the glider. Anybody know what the front of the vehicle, what the pole is? This is good old American ingenuity. When they got overseas, the Germans were running wires across the roads. So the GIs realized we have to counter that. So the ordnance guys would take fence posts and they would weld these on the front of the Jeeps. And this would hit the wire and, prevent a terrible incident from happening. So you see vehicles from World War II with these on the front. You'll notice he's got some movie starlets taped on the inside there. That's Hedy Lamarr and that's Ingrid Bergman. Those are his two favorite stars from the 1940s. So again, they lived out of these, they ate in these, they slept in these, they're dirty. We had a little man down here about a month ago. He drove 11,000 miles in his Jeep in Europe. His Jeep had been ran over by a tank, been hit by a mortar, and hit by a machine gun 3 different times. He could walk around and tell you every spot on that Jeep that was damaged. The American war effort during World War II, full mobilization, and you probably talked about this during the home front. Every factory began working for the government, creating war production. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles, planes, tanks, guns. All the women worked in the factories. Most of the women worked in the factories. They were called Rosie the Riveter. And they cranked out this amazing supply. These Jeeps were not only used by the Americans, we gave them to the Canadians, we gave them to the British, we gave them to the Commonwealth. Even the Russians had these. So So there you go. We appreciate you guys coming today, and we'll see you next Friday for your next class.